Hello, my name is John Horton. I'm an assistant professor at NYU Stern School of Business, and this is joint work with my co-author Ramesh Johari at Stanford. So consider a matching market, in this case a labor market, where workers apply to firms. Workers and firms differ, and one dimension that workers noticeably are differentiated on, even within a particular occupation, is their expertise or experience in that profession. So in a labor market, we might have both high and low type workers applying to firms and possibly showing up in the same applicant pool. And a question for a firm is what kind of workers are they looking for? Are they looking for highly experienced, highly qualified workers, or are they okay with entry-level workers who, maybe not be as expert and are more likely to make mistakes? So just for now, assume that firms do differ in their willingness to pay for what we'll call quality. So you can imagine some firm that has a task that they want completed or a job that they want to fill that's mission critical for the firm, and they're willing to hire the very best person, even at a very high wage. And then we might also have other occupations where or other tasks that the firm is trying to have completed where, it's nice to have, but they're very price sensitive. It's sort of a cost center for the firm, and getting it right is really not essential. They're sort of open to making some mistakes. So if we go back to the matching aspect of the labor market, if would-be applicants could see what kind of worker a firm was interested in, if they knew the firm's preferences, you might imagine that they would try to sort and apply to the firm that's actually a good fit for them. So high types would apply to high type firms and low types would apply to low type firms. Of course, in practice, workers might know something about what a firm is looking for. So they can read the job description. Maybe they know something about people that are working there presently, who had the job in the past. They might know something about what the firm is interested in, but they probably don't know precisely. And so you probably get a lot of applications that are kind of doomed from the start. They're really applying to a job that's not a good fit for them. So you may have a highly experienced worker applying to a firm that's really price sensitive and sort of can't it's impossible for them to hire that worker, and you have entry-level people applying for jobs that they're underqualified for. And so, a question is, can we get firms to reveal their willingness to pay for quality? Or in other words, can we get them to reveal their type to the market? If firms reveal, the workers don't need to make a lot of inferences about the firm's preferences. The preferences are just sort of written on the firm's head. So a firm would see, a worker would see that this is a high type firm, this is a good fit for me. A low type worker would see, this is a low type firm, this is the job application for me. And we'd waste, we wouldn't have the waste involved of workers applying to job openings of the wrong kind then. Now, if firms are thinking about considering their what we might call their vertical preferences in this matching market, this sounds great in the sense that you'll get workers of the right type for you. But to the extent that when you say what your vertical preference is, you're also revealing something about your willingness to pay, there's some strategic considerations. So if you're a firm and you say hi to the market, maybe you'll get more applicants, or maybe you'll get better applicants, more experienced applicants. On the other hand, those workers might condition on the fact that now you've said that money is no object, and you might face a much higher wage bids. Similarly, stating low, you might get considerably lower bids if the workers believe you, if they think that you're signaling credibly and that you're not, you won't hire if the wage bill is too high, the proposed wage is too high. So you'll get a cost savings. On the other hand, you might get worse applicants or fewer applicants. And a firm that's thinking about what to say has to consider these two forces. So, in the previous slide, I said we. When we think about firms signaling to reveal their willingness to pay for quality, the we in that question is a little unclear, but we might think of that as the social planner who maybe would intervene in the market to create some signaling opportunity. And we know that signaling opportunities or signaling can solve informational problems in marketplaces, but they're not typically seen as something that can be designed. They're something that emerges naturally, or people kind of can see that, hey, if I get a lot of education, I'll reveal that I'm someone of with high ability. And so it hasn't really been a tool in the market designer's toolbox. But I would say that that's very much changing. You see a lot of designed marketplaces that have differentiation, both horizontal and vertical, and there's a strong market designing, typically for-profit firm that can introduce signaling opportunities that could potentially communicate some of that variation to the other side of the market. And that's really what makes this paper, this talk, partially about markets, but also about digitization and what information technology can do to markets. And so in this talk, what I'm really going to talk mostly about is whether or not a platform can create a separating equilibrium where firms reveal their vertical preferences to the other side of the market. And then secondarily, I'm going to talk about whether it should do that. So whether or not actually creating a separating equilibrium is something that the market should pursue. Does it create better matches? Does it create more surplus? And so the context for this talk is going to be a large online labor market. And this is a market where people do work that can be done remotely. So you should be thinking of things like computer programming, graphic design, data entry. And in this market, it has the matching aspect of it is decentralized, in that employers post jobs and workers apply. And critically, they propose an hourly wage when they apply for a job. And there is some back and forth that can happen, but in general, employers take this as a take it or leave it offer by the worker. And so what I'm going to discuss mainly today is about the platform's attempts to induce a separating equilibrium. And what they wanted to do was to create a new signaling opportunity for would-be employers, where they could state to the market what their vertical preferences were over applicants, and then we could see, do we get workers sorting and applying to the jobs that are the right type, and hopefully making better matches. So when it was widely implemented, or the intent was that when an employer was posting a job, they would signal their vertical preferences to the market. And this space of messages that they could send were just essentially low, medium, and high. And so you can see here, if they selected low or entry level, they're saying, I'm looking for freelancers with the lowest rates. On the other end of the spectrum, if they say they're looking for an expert, it says, I'm willing to pay higher rates for the most experienced freelancers. And then there's a medium tier in between. And so this preference that the employer has chosen would be shown to applicants who are considering applying for a particular job. Now, how it would work, just to summarize, the employer picks the preference. They know that it's going to be revealed, and then would-be applicants are shown that preference and could potentially use it when deciding what jobs to apply to. So in introducing this signaling opportunity to the marketplace, there were some initial questions. One, do vertical preferences actually vary? So at the start of the talk, I proposed that firms differed in their willingness to pay for quality, but is this actually something that exists in a real market? Do we actually have any kind of variation, and is it not completely subsumed by other sources of information that workers might have? And then the second question is, if employers know that this signal is going to be revealed to freelancers, how does it affect their choice? You might imagine that an employer, knowing that their signal is going to be revealed, might choose something differently than if they thought the information was just going to go to a platform, for example, or just be known by the platform. So what we did is there was an initial experiment where employers choose their preference knowing ex ante whether or not it will be revealed. So an employer is posting a job and they receive either one version of the job posting page or the other, where they still have the same three choices that they can pick from, but one says would-be applicants will see your choice. We're going to call that shown preference equals 1. And we have another one where the would-be applicants will not see your choice. So the employer knows up front how they answer this question is going to be used in the market. And so let me just show you for one category of work on the market. So this is software development. As I said earlier, there's lots of different kinds of work that gets done, but this is just for software development. And we're going to look at the percentage of employers selecting each of the three tiers. So we have low, medium, and high here on the x-axis, and then the y-axis we have the percentage. And so what you can see is that there's a lot of concentration in the middle, about a little less than 60% of employers choose the medium tier, but we have some weight on both low and high. And now at the top, what I've put there is that's the percentage, the change in the fraction by shown preference status. So this is the gap in the fraction of employers choosing, say, low, medium, or high, or in this case, low, based on this randomly implemented shown preference revelation. And so if we look at the other categories, administrative support, customer service, these are all the different things that types of work that people are doing on the market. What you can see is across these categories, there's really no difference in the fraction choosing that particular tier. So it doesn't seem to be the case that employers conditioned their tier choice on whether or not it would be revealed. The second thing we can see is that there's substantial between category variation. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner in administrative support, almost a little bit more than 60% of people chose the low tier, and essentially no one chooses the high tier. If we go down to the lower right corner, we have networking and information systems. The most common is the middle tier, and the second most common is the high tier, with about 30% of employers choosing that tier, and a relatively small fraction actually choosing the low tier. And then within those categories, now, clearly category says a lot about what people are doing, but within a category, you still see quite a bit of variation. So, administrative support, yeah, the most common is low, but a lot of point mass is at medium, if not much at high. And so, to summarize, do we see some variation in vertical preferences? Yes. Clearly the case. And do employers seem to condition their signal on knowledge about revelation? Well, no, not to the extent that we can see it manifest itself in differences in means. Now, there could be some kind of hidden sorting or hidden something that we're not picking up just by looking at fractions, but by just looking at fractions, nothing seems to be going on. Now, the next question of interest, or series of questions, is about how workers actually respond to these signals. So do they, one, when they can see it in the market, do they sort in the expected direction? Do they take, when they're deciding not just what jobs to apply to, but when they apply to a job opening, does their wage bid reflect their knowledge about the employer's willingness to pay? And then finally, and this relates to, kind of bleeds over to the question about the efficiency of all this, is we actually see a reduction in the number of applications. So do we see that fewer applications need to be sent to create as many matches as before? Now, there's a problem with the experiment that we just described. In that experiment, although we didn't find any evidence that employers were conditioning their tier choices, technically it's endogenous. It could have been affected by the treatment. And we didn't really know ex ante when we were designing this experiment that we would get this result. So we have another arm of the experiment, which we call the ambiguous arm. And in this, what we did was we told employers that we might reveal their choice. So they were asked this question about their preference, their vertical preference, with the knowledge that it might be revealed to freelancers. And then, of course, we randomized, and so either they did see it, so workers could condition on it, or they could not. And what this lets us do is look by tier, so by low, medium, and high, what were the effects of revelation without worrying that the tier itself was being affected by the experiment. And so let's just start with the first one. Do we see workers sort in the expected direction? We want to have some measure of an applicant's experience at the time that they applied. And one nice measure of experience on the platform is how much they've earned in total and how many hours they've worked. So we have a snapshot for each application. What was the worker's experience at that moment in time? And so to measure changes in applicant pool composition, potentially to detect this sorting, we're just going to run a very simple regression where we'll have as an outcome some measure of the worker's experience, and we're going to regress that on the signal tier. And we'll do it both when the preferences were shown and when they were not, and then we're going to compare those coefficients to each other. So I'm going to show you this is a regression outcome where the outcome is the applicant's prior earnings at the time that they applied for a job opening. On the x-axis here, we have our two treatment assignments, so whether or not it was a job where preferences were hidden or preferences were shown. And then we can see now, these are the point estimates. If we look, when preferences were not shown, we see that the point estimates, and then remember, this is the measure of their prior experience in terms of earnings. The most experienced workers are applying to the high jobs, less experienced the medium, the least experienced are applying to the lowest jobs. And this is without knowing what the job is. So this isn't the case when the signal is not revealed. So clearly workers are picking up quite a bit of information just on the category or the job description to sort in the expected direction. But when we actually reveal it, we see sorting in the expected direction. So in the high tier employers get applicants that are about 7% more experienced. In the low tier, we have a large reduction. They're about 20% less experienced. And in the medium tier, it's a bit higher but less pronounced than in the high tier. So now we consider whether workers condition their wage bids on the employer's perceived willingness to pay. And to do that, what we're going to do is look at the applicant pools of the workers, look at the applicant pools of the employers, and then at each percentile, if we order people by their bids, what does the 10th percentile look like? What does the 20th percentile look like? Etc. for low, medium, and high, conditional upon revelation. And so if we start in the high tier, we can see basically across the distribution, employers that reveal have a high tier preference revealed get 10% higher wage bids. We can see in medium tier it's a little bit less, around 5%, and then in low tier they get wage bids that are about 12 to 15% lower. So there's a really strong change in the applicant wage bidding as a result of revelation. And these are all comparisons to employers that said high tier, and then when they got it revealed, that it's a comparison within the high tier. What is the effects of revelation? Now, so this certainly looks like workers might be conditioning their wage bids, but as we saw from the first question, there's a fair amount of compositional change in the applicant pool. So this change in wage bids could just be due to composition. So one nice feature of our data is that we actually see workers sending many applications. And so workers do apply across tiers. So you see the same worker sometimes applying to a job that's medium tier, sometimes high tier. And within those jobs by their tier, we also have variation in whether or not it was exposed to that worker. And so what this lets us do is we can run a within worker regression where our outcome is the log wage bid of a worker, in this case worker I applying to opening J, and critically we can include a worker-specific fixed effect. So we can capture, essentially we can take compositional changes off the table and have a worker-specific effect that deals with this, but then we'll have a whole bunch of interactions between the tier of the job opening and whether or not the worker knew it. So the interaction with this shown preference variable. And when we do this regression, what we can see is that when an employer knows they're facing a low tier employer, and so in this regression the low tier is the omitted category, they bid about 10% less. And in contrast, when they know they're facing a high tier employer, they bid about 7% more. And these results actually come out a little bit more sharply if you look at it graphically, where here on the x-axis I have low, medium, and high, and then in red, the part that's circled here, this is when they can't see the preference. So this is when they're just making an inference. And you can see that workers kind of pick up a little bit of the employer's willingness to pay, even when it's not revealed. But when it is revealed, the effects are just much, much sharper. So when they know they're facing a low-tier employer, they bid down. When they know they're facing a high-tier employer, they bid up. And so this question, workers, do they condition their wage bids on willingness to pay? I think it's a pretty strong yes, they do. The next question is, do we actually see applications being reduced? And so one idea here was that if the employer's preference was known to workers, they would not send applications to those openings that are a bad fit. And this could improve the efficiency of the matching process. And so here the outcome is going to be the log application count. We can see overall, if we just pool everything together, blue here is the treatment, we can see about a 5% reduction in the count of applications. However, if we condition on tier, which we can do in this ambiguous arm of the experiment, we can see the effects are really concentrated in the low tier. And so there's not much of a difference in the medium and high tier, but in the low tier, if workers know it's a low tier opening, they're far less likely to apply to that job. And so we do see clear evidence that there's a reduction in the application count in the low tier, and overall the evidence isn't super strong, but maybe some kind of overall reduction. And that would be consistent with the reduction that we see in the low tier. So then the next set of questions we have is, well, we seem to be able to induce employers to sort and say what their preferences are. We seem to be able to get workers to apply to the right jobs, albeit taking and changing their wage bids. But is this a good thing? So first, does this actually change the kinds of matches that get formed? So you could imagine that workers, the composition changes, wage bids change, but pools are large and heterogeneous enough that firms can essentially still pick who they would have wanted anyway, and it really doesn't matter. And then if we do change the matches, have we changed the matches in a way that's positive? So here what we're going to do is, just for comparison, I'm going to show you, similar to what I showed you before, the outcome here is first this is the applicant's wage bid, and then we're going to be comparing it to the hired worker wage bid. And so this is in the low tier. And remember, this is where we saw a very large reduction in wage bidding by low tier employees. They bid down substantially, on the order of 15%, or here the point estimate is 14%. Now, when we look at the actual workers that are hired, they're even less experienced. So among employers that said they were low tier, we see even a bigger drop in the kinds of workers they hire, but we also see that the same compositional change or the same wage bid change shows up in the worker who actually gets hired. It's quite similar, so 14% and 10%. If we look at the other tiers, it's kind of that same. The hired workers are even more in the direction of the firm's preferences. So if we look at the high tier, they hire workers that are considerably more expensive. Medium tier, it's about the same. As you saw, low tier is quite a bit lower. But we see about the same pass-through of the compositional change in the worker who actually gets hired. So the firms that had their signals revealed ended up hiring a different kind of worker, or definitely a different wage bid. And then in terms of the composition, we see similarly that the kind of worker that showed up in the applicant pool was different, and the kind of worker who gets hired was different. And it's really pronounced in the low tier. You can see that past worker experience is in the low tier, almost 30% lower. So a large reduction in the experience of the worker who gets hired. So the fact that we're able to induce a separating equilibrium and change which kind of workers are getting hired and at what wages, that was the platform's goal. But the question is this actually a preferable equilibrium? Is this one that we would actually prefer to the status quo. And this is actually a pretty challenging question to answer. You have to come up with some definition of what you think surplus looks like here, and it really kind of depends on from whose perspective. So from the platform's perspective, we probably care about the total surplus that's generated by the matches we have formed. And what's nice about that is we can ignore wages as just being a transfer between the two parties. If we're the employer or from the firm's perspective, we care about the surplus they get from the match, but we have to subtract the wages that they're getting paid. And then from the worker's perspective, we do care about the wages, and then we have to have some notion of the cost that's required to actually perform the task. One perspective that I think is useful, and this kind of mirrors the platform or social planner perspective, is really to focus on the quantity of the good transacted. And we can measure that pretty precisely, so we can see, do we actually have more hours worked done through the platform? And they're somewhat complicated by the fact that not all hours are equally productive, and so we might also think about focusing on the wage bill, just the total economic value of the work that's created as measured by wages. And so here I'm going to show you a number of different outcomes. One thing that's different about what I've shown you so far, to get a little more power, because we want to look at match outcomes, we combine both the ambiguous and the explicit arms of the experiment. And so first, one way that you can very directly improve welfare is if you can get the same number of matches with fewer job applications, as job applications are both costly to send and costly to process. And so we can see that the number of applications do fall. It's mostly confined to the low tier, but you see some evidence of a reduction in the other tiers and an overall drop. And despite that reduction, we see really no evidence that in the probability that job opening was filled is maybe slightly higher. So the matching process seems to have gotten a bit more efficient. As expected with the pass-through of the wage bidding and composition effects, wages are considerably higher in the high tier, about the same in the medium tier, and a little bit lower in the low tier. Now, recall that this is not strictly just a change, where the same worker is getting a higher or lower wage. Some of this is composition. And so then when we look at overall quantities, we can see that in all of the tiers, hours worked increase and the total wage bill increases. In fact, the hours worked is a little bit higher than the total wage bill, and that just reflects the fact that wages fell a small amount. So if we think that hours worked and the total wage bill is sort of a proxy for how much surplus is being generated in the market, the separating equilibrium seems to be attractive. So some concluding thoughts. So, from the platform's perspective, this was very much a success, and so they rolled it out market-wide afterwards, and we can kind of look and see that the fraction of employers picked all the separate tiers. It seems to have kind of continued on in the future. Employees were absolutely willing to reveal, workers sorted as expected. We see this increase in hours worked that's consistent with improved match quality. And what I think is fairly exciting, given the challenges that new workers have in getting established, the largest effects were really in the low tier and helping relatively low-skilled workers get hired. And I think that basically any matching market that has heterogeneity in preferences that would-be sellers have to consider, this mechanism that we use, or this design pattern, could really be applied in a lot of places. I don't think it just is sort of particular online work. You could think almost any market where you have heterogeneity and communicating that to the other side, it can be valuable. All right, so thank you very much. So just again, the title of the paper is Engineering a Separating Equilibrium. It's joint work with Ramesh Johari, and these are links to the draft of the paper and the slides.